A 40-year-old Soviet warplane is currently hunting Iranian drones over Ukrainian skies. And somehow, it's working. When Poland and Slovakia announced they were sending 33 MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine, aviation experts around the world had the same reaction. Why bother? These aircraft rolled off production lines in the 1980s. They're relics from an era when the Berlin Wall still stood and the Soviet Union was a superpower. Ukrainian pilots themselves have been begging for American F-16s, claiming they need Western technology to dominate the skies. But here's the strange part. The F-16 is just as old as the MiG-29. Both aircraft emerged from the same Cold War arms race. So what makes one obsolete and the other a game-changer? The answer reveals something fascinating about how modern air warfare actually works, something that contradicts almost everything you think you know about fighter jet. And it involves a controversy that almost derailed the entire donation, accusations of Russian sabotage that sparked a full criminal investigation. The truth behind these aging warplanes is far more complex than anyone wants to admit. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, military analysts gave Ukraine's Air Force approximately 72 hours before complete annihilation. The math seems simple. Russia possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, more advanced aircraft, better missiles, and complete electronic warfare dominance. Ukrainian jets would be swept from the skies within days, clearing the way for Russian air supremacy and the rapid collapse of Ukrainian ground defenses. Those analysts were spectacularly wrong. More than 2 years into the conflict, Ukraine's Air Force hasn't just survived. It's still conducting combat operations daily. 5 tactical aviation brigades continue operating supersonic fighter aircraft across the entire front line. That's roughly 100 jets still taking to the skies, still engaging Russian forces, still refusing to accept the extinction that everyone predicted. Understanding how Ukraine achieved this requires looking at numbers that most coverage ignores. The inheritance. Ukraine's air power story begins with the Soviet collapse in 1991. When the USSR dissolved, military assets were divided among the newly independent republics based largely on where equipment happened to be stationed. Ukraine, which had hosted significant Soviet military infrastructure, inherited one of the largest air forces in Europe almost overnight. The haul was staggering. Hundreds of combat aircraft, dozens of air bases, maintenance facilities, training infrastructure, stockpiles of missiles and ammunition. Ukraine suddenly possessed more military aviation capability than most NATO members combined. The MiG-29 Fulcrum represented the most advanced fighter in this inheritance, with approximately 200 aircraft transferred to Ukrainian control. But inheritance isn't the same as capability. The Soviet military had been designed as an integrated whole. Aircraft in Ukraine relied on supply chains running through Russia. Spare parts came from factories now located in foreign countries. Technical expertise was concentrated in institutions that Ukraine no longer controlled. Training programs had been coordinated across the entire Soviet system. Overnight, all of that disappeared. Ukraine spent the 1990s and 2000s watching its inherited air power slowly decay. Aircraft that couldn't be maintained were cannibalized for parts. Jets that couldn't fly were parked in storage. Pilots who couldn't get flight hours left for civilian careers or other countries. By the time Russia began its aggression in 2014, Ukraine's once impressive air force had shrunk dramatically. Of those original 200 MiG-29s, only about 50 remained operational when the full-scale invasion began. The rest had been sold, scrapped, or left to rust in hangars across the country. The brigade structure. Ukraine's current tactical aviation structure reflects both Soviet legacy and wartime adaptation. The 5 operational brigades each serve specific functions within the overall air defense and ground support mission. The 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade operates from western Ukraine, providing air defense for critical infrastructure and serving as a reserve force. The 114th Tactical Aviation Brigade focuses on the central region, while the 831st Tactical Aviation Brigade has become famous for its frontline operations in the east. Additional brigades cover the southern front and provide specialized capabilities. Each brigade operates a mix of aircraft types, not just MiG-29s. The Ukrainian Air Force also flies Su-27 flankers, which are larger and more capable in some respects than the Fulcrum. Su-24 Fencer bombers provide ground attack capability. Su-25 Frogfoot aircraft serve as close air support platforms, the Soviet equivalent of the American A-10 Warthog. This diversity creates both advantages and nightmares. Having multiple aircraft types means Ukraine can match platforms to missions. The Su-27's longer range and heavier payload make it better suited for some intercept missions. The MiG-29's agility and smaller size work better for others. The Su-25's armor and weapons load make it ideal for supporting ground troops under fire. But maintaining 4 different aircraft types with 4 different supply chains, 4 different maintenance requirements, and 4 different training programs stretches resources impossibly thin. Every hour spent training a MiG-29 mechanic is an hour not spent training someone on Su-27 systems. Every spare part sourced for fulcrums is money not available for flanker repairs. The attrition reality. As of April 2023, Ukraine had confirmed losing at least 17 MiG-29s since the invasion began. That number has certainly increased since, though exact figures remain classified for obvious operational security reasons. Losing 17 aircraft from a starting pool of 50 represents a 34% attrition rate in just over a year of fighting. At that pace, simple math suggests Ukraine would run out of fulcrums within 3 years of the invasion's start. And that calculation assumes the loss rate remains constant, which it won't. As aircraft age and maintenance becomes more difficult, mechanical failures will increase. As spare parts become scarcer, more jets will be grounded permanently. As experienced pilots are killed or injured, newer pilots with less training will make more mistakes. This is the slow-motion crisis that the 33 replacement aircraft are meant to address. Adding 33 MiG-29s to a depleted fleet of roughly 33 surviving fulcrums effectively doubles Ukraine's operational capacity for this aircraft type. It's not just about having more planes. It's about reversing the death spiral of attrition that threatened to eliminate Ukraine's MiG-29 capability entirely. The sortie problem. A sortie is a single operational flight by a single aircraft. One jet taking off, completing a mission, and landing counts as one sortie. This metric matters enormously because it reveals how hard an air force is actually working. Before the invasion, a typical peacetime air force might conduct a few dozen sorties per week across its entire fleet. Pilots need rest. Aircraft need maintenance. There's no urgency driving operations beyond training requirements and occasional exercises. Ukraine's wartime sortie rate is something else entirely. Individual MiG-29s are flying 1 to 2 combat sorties per day, sometimes more during periods of intense fighting. That pace would be considered extreme even for an air force with unlimited resources and perfect logistics. For Ukraine, operating with limited spare parts, exhausted maintenance crews, and constant threat of airfield attacks, it's approaching the physically impossible. Consider what a single sortie requires. Pre-flight inspection of all aircraft systems, fueling, weapons loading, pilot briefing on mission parameters, weather and threat environment, takeoff, mission execution, which might involve anything from drone hunting to electronic reconnaissance to actual air combat, return flight, landing, post-flight inspection, debriefing, maintenance for any issues discovered. Now imagine doing that twice per day, every day, for months on end, with aircraft that are 40 years old and haven't received proper depot-level maintenance in years. The math doesn't work. Except somehow it has to, because the alternative is losing air capability entirely. The maintenance nightmare. Every aircraft ever built has a maintenance schedule. Certain components need inspection after specific flight hours. Other parts must be replaced at regular intervals regardless of apparent condition. Major overhauls require removing the aircraft from service for weeks or months at specialized facilities. Ukraine's MiG-29s are operating far outside their designed maintenance parameters. Inspections that should happen every 50 flight hours are being pushed to 100 hours or more. Replacement parts that should be installed preventatively are being run until they actually fail. Major overhauls that should occur at depot facilities are being improvised at frontline air bases by mechanics working with whatever they can find. This approach keeps aircraft flying in the short term. It also guarantees increased failure rates over time. An engine that should be replaced at 350 hours might keep running at 400 hours. Or it might fail catastrophically at 360 hours, potentially killing the pilot and destroying an irreplaceable aircraft. A hydraulic line that should be inspected might look fine from the outside while developing an invisible crack that ruptures during high-G maneuvering. An avionics component pushed past its service life might work perfectly until it doesn't, leaving a pilot blind and deaf at the worst possible moment. Ukrainian maintenance crews are performing miracles daily. They're keeping aircraft flying that by any reasonable standard should be grounded. They're fabricating parts that no longer exist. They're developing repair techniques never contemplated by the original Soviet designers. But miracles have limits. The pilot equation. Aircraft mean nothing without pilots to fly them. Ukraine's pilot situation adds another layer of complexity to the numbers game. Training a fighter pilot from scratch takes approximately 2 years under peacetime conditions. That timeline assumes access to training aircraft, experienced instructors, flight simulators, and the luxury of gradual skill development. Wartime training can compress this somewhat, but the physics of learning to fly a supersonic aircraft don't change based on urgency. Ukraine began the war with a limited pool of qualified MiG-29 pilots. Some of the most experienced have been killed. Others have been wounded and require lengthy recovery before returning to flight status. A few have accumulated so many combat hours that fatigue and psychological stress are degrading their performance. Replacing these pilots takes time that doesn't exist. Ukraine has been running accelerated training programs, but there's only so fast you can push pilot development without creating more risks than you solve. A poorly trained pilot isn't just a waste of limited training resources. They're a threat to the aircraft they fly and the missions they're assigned. The 33 replacement aircraft address only half of the equation. Having more jets means nothing if you don't have enough qualified pilots to fly them. This is another reason why the MiG-29 donations matter specifically. Ukraine already has pilots trained on this platform. They don't need to learn new aircraft systems. They just need functioning aircraft to fly. The Russian comparison. To understand what Ukraine's Air Force is actually accomplishing, compare it to what they're fighting against. Russia's aerospace forces entered the war with approximately 1,500 combat aircraft of various types. That includes Su-35 flankery jets that represent Russia's most advanced operational fighter. Su-34 fullback strike aircraft designed specifically for ground attack. Su-30 multi-role fighters capable of both air superiority and precision strike missions. MiG-31 interceptors designed to counter NATO bombers and cruise missiles. On paper, Russia should have achieved air supremacy within the first week. They didn't. And the reasons reveal something important about how modern air power actually works. Russia has lost over 70 combat aircraft since the invasion began. Some to Ukrainian fighters. Some to ground-based air defenses. Some to mechanical failures. Some to friendly fire incidents. These losses represent a far smaller percentage of Russia's total fleet than Ukraine's losses represent of theirs. But they've been enough to fundamentally change Russian air operations. Russia now largely avoids flying manned aircraft within range of Ukrainian air defenses. Their advanced jets rarely approach the front lines. When they do conduct strike missions, they typically launch weapons from Russian airspace rather than penetrating Ukrainian territory. This defensive posture means Russia cannot achieve the air superiority their doctrine demands. They can't provide the close air support their ground forces need. They can't interdict Ukrainian logistics with the effectiveness their plans assumed. Ukraine's surviving 100-odd jets, including those exhausted MiG-29s, have forced a superpower into tactical air stalemate. The strategic math. 33 additional MiG-29s change the strategic calculation in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Right now, Ukraine must keep almost every operational aircraft flying almost constantly. There's no reserve. There's no buffer. If an aircraft goes down for maintenance, the remaining fleet must absorb those missions. If several aircraft go down simultaneously, some missions simply don't happen. Adding 33 fulcrums creates what military planners call depth. Suddenly there's slack in the system. Aircraft can be rotated through proper maintenance cycles without sacrificing mission capability. Pilots can get adequate rest between sorties. Mechanics can perform inspections they've been deferring for months. This depth also creates tactical flexibility. With a larger fleet, Ukraine can concentrate aircraft for specific operations without leaving other areas uncovered. They can surge sortie rates temporarily for critical missions without burning out pilots and equipment. They can absorb losses without immediately falling below operational minimums. None of this transforms Ukraine's air force into something capable of matching Russia plane for plane. But it extends the timeline. It keeps Ukrainian aircraft flying through 2024 and beyond. It buys time for whatever comes next, whether that's eventual F-16 deliveries or continued adaptation of existing platforms. The human factor. Behind every statistic is a pilot strapping into a cockpit. These are men and women who know exactly what they're flying. They understand the MiG-29's limitations better than any Western analyst. They've read the after-action reports from Desert Storm. They know that on paper they shouldn't be accomplishing what they're accomplishing. They fly anyway. Major Vitam Voyashov, callsign Karaya, became one of the most documented pilots of the conflict before his last combat mission. He shot down 5 Shahid-136 drones and 2 cruise missiles, protecting civilians who would never know his name. When debris from one of those drones struck his aircraft and forced him to eject, he'd already made a difference that no specification sheet could capture. He's not unique. Dozens of Ukrainian pilots have similar stories, most of which will never be told publicly for security reasons. They're flying aircraft their grandfathers might recognize, using tactics developed through brutal trial and error, against an enemy with every material advantage. The numbers say Ukraine's air force shouldn't still exist. The pilots make sure it does. The path forward. Those 33 replacement MiG-29s represent a bridge to something else. Ukraine's military leadership understands that Soviet-era aircraft cannot sustain air operations indefinitely. Spare parts will eventually run out entirely. Pilot fatigue will reach breaking points. The gap between Ukrainian and Russian capabilities will widen as Russia introduces newer systems and Ukraine cannot. F-16s or other Western aircraft remain the long-term solution. But that transition requires training pipelines that don't yet exist at scale. It requires logistics infrastructure for aircraft that Ukraine has never operated. It requires ammunition production for weapons systems Ukraine doesn't currently manufacture. The MiG-29s buy time for all of that to happen. Every month that Ukrainian fulcrums keep flying is another month for F-16 training programs to produce qualified pilots. Every successful intercept of a Russian drone is another day of protected airspace while Western systems are prepared. Every sortie flown is proof that Ukraine's air force remains a factor that Russia cannot ignore. The numbers matter. 100 jets, 33 replacements, 17 confirmed losses, 5 brigades, 1 or 2 sorties per aircraft per day. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. They never do. You probably heard about the Ghost of Kiev, the legendary MiG-29 pilot who supposedly shot down multiple Russian jets in the opening days of the invasion. Social media exploded with the story. People wanted a hero, and the ghost delivered. There was just one problem. That specific pilot didn't actually exist. The Ukrainian government eventually admitted the ghost was a myth, a composite of several different pilots and engagements created to boost morale during the darkest hours of the invasion. But here's what most people missed in that revelation. The air combat those stories were based on actually happened. Ukrainian MiG-29 pilots really were engaging Russian aircraft. They really were scoring kills. The fiction was the single superhero narrative. The reality was a collective effort by dozens of pilots flying outdated equipment against a numerically superior enemy. Thanks to social media, we can now experience this conflict through the eyes of real Ukrainian pilots. Major Vitam Voyashov, callsign Karaya, became one of the most documented fighter pilots of the modern era. Before his final mission, he had shot down 5 Iranian Shahid-136 kamikaze drones and 2 cruise missiles. His last engagement ended when debris from a drone he had just destroyed struck his aircraft, forcing him to eject. He survived, but his MiG didn't. These are the real stories behind Ukraine's air war. No mythical aces. Just exhausted pilots pushing aging equipment to its absolute limit. Here's something that might surprise you. When you dig into the actual loss statistics, most combat aircraft destroyed in this war weren't shot down in dramatic dogfight. They weren't outmaneuvered by enemy aces or defeated in one-on-one aerial combat. They were killed by things on the ground. Man-portable guided missiles fired from IGLA launchers, S-300 surface-to-air systems, cruise missiles slamming into parked aircraft at air bases. Over half of all aircraft losses on both sides came from ground-based threats, not air-to-air engagement. 7 Ukrainian MiG-29s were destroyed while sitting on the runway. They never even had a chance to take off. 2 separate Russian missile strikes caught them completely exposed at their respective air bases. 8 more were lost in various forms of air combat, but that category includes ground fire, not just enemy jet. The romanticized vision of modern air warfare, 2 pilots squaring off in a turning fight at 30,000 feet, is almost entirely fiction in this conflict. What we're actually seeing is a war of detection, positioning, and missile ranges. Whoever sees the other first usually wins, and whoever is caught on the ground loses everything. This reality has changed how both sides operate. Russia has largely avoided flying their advanced aircraft anywhere near the front lines. They lost too many early in the conflict. Ukraine has responded by turning their remaining MiGs into something they were never originally designed to be: dedicated drone hunters. The Iranian-made Shahid-136 has become one of the most hated weapons in this war. These kamikaze drones cost a fraction of what a cruise missile costs, but they can devastate infrastructure, terrorize civilians, and overwhelm air defenses through sheer numbers. Ukraine has been throwing everything they have at these threats, including their MiG-29s. The Fulcrum has proven surprisingly effective at this mission, despite some significant limitations. A typical air defense sortie involves a MiG-29 armed with 2 radar-guided R-27 missiles and 4 heat-seeking R-73s. The problem is that these heat-seeking missiles weren't designed to track small drones with minimal infrared signatures. A Shahid-136 weighs about 440 pounds and doesn't generate the kind of heat signature that makes tracking easy. Pilots have had to adapt their tactics, getting closer than comfortable and relying on visual identification in ways that feel almost primitive for modern jet combat. The R-27 radar-guided missiles face their own challenges. They have a minimum engagement range that forces pilots to maintain specific distances before they can even fire. Too close and the missile won't arm properly. Too far and you might waste a shot on a target you can't reliably hit. These constraints turn every intercept into a calculated puzzle rather than a simple point-and-shoot engagement. Two pieces of technology define a fighter jet's combat effectiveness: its radar detection system and its fire control system. This is where the MiG-29's age really shows. Over the decades, the Fulcrum has been fitted with various radar systems ranging from early models with just 35-kilometer detection range and single-target tracking to the more advanced N010 Zucchini radar capable of detecting targets up to 120 kilometers away in head-on approaches and tracking 10 targets while engaging 4 simultaneously. That sounds impressive until you compare it to what the F-16 offers. The upgraded F-16's AESA radar can track up to 20 targets at once. It can detect enemies at nearly 200 kilometers, almost twice the distance of the MiG's best system. Lockheed officials describe it as giving pilots a wider view in every direction: laterally, horizontally, diagonally, and vertically. This same radar technology appears in the F-35, America's most advanced fighter. The difference in capability is staggering. A Ukrainian pilot, trying to describe this to a ground soldier, used a perfect analogy. Flying a MiG-29 against modern Russian air defenses is like using a rifle with iron sights while your enemy has high-tech scope. You might be carrying the same caliber weapon. You might even be a better shot. But they're going to see you long before you see them, and in air combat, that advantage is often fatal. This is exactly why Ukrainian pilots keep asking for F-16s despite the aircraft being technically the same age as the MiG-29. The airframe age isn't the problem. The technology inside is what matters. The F-16 has been continuously upgraded since the 1980s. The MiGs Ukraine inherited have largely remained frozen in time. When Slovakia announced they were donating MiG-29s to Ukraine, the process should have been straightforward. Pack up the planes, fly them across the border, done. Instead, the handover turned into a controversy that sparked a full criminal investigation and raised serious questions about who exactly had been maintaining these aircraft. Reports emerged of defects in the fulcrum part. Strange problems that appeared in components only accessible to maintenance personnel. The Slovak defense minister initially pointed fingers directly at Russian contractor mechanics who had been working on the aircraft. Police launched an investigation. The accusation made headlines around the world. Russian saboteurs had allegedly booby-trapped fighter jets destined for Ukraine. But there was a problem with finding alternatives. These aircraft had been sitting in hangars since 1993. How many Western mechanics have expertise working on Soviet-era MiG-29s? The answer is almost none. Slovakia had been relying on Russian contractors because they were essentially the only people who knew how to maintain these planes. Allowing potential enemies to work on aircraft being sent to fight their own country seems insane in retrospect. But at the time, options were limited. The investigation concluded with a controversial finding. There was no evidence of deliberate sabotage. The defects were real, but they appeared to be the result of age and neglect rather than intentional tampering. The most damning evidence of deterioration was an engine rated for 350 hours of operation that failed after just 78 hours. The aircraft weren't sabotaged. They were simply falling apart from decades of inadequate maintenance and storage. Understanding that these aircraft needed serious work before they could fly combat missions, Ukraine and its partners began installing modern systems into the aging fulcrums. The upgrades represent a fascinating blend of Soviet airframes and Western technology that was never supposed to exist. The Rockwell-Collins navigation system replaced Soviet-era equipment. Secure communication systems were installed to prevent Russian eavesdropping. Perhaps most importantly, new identification friend or foe systems were added. This might sound like a minor upgrade, but it addresses a deadly problem that has plagued both sides throughout this conflict. Friendly fire incidents involving aircraft have occurred repeatedly. When you can't reliably identify whether an approaching jet belongs to you or the enemy, pilots make mistakes, sometimes fatal ones. New cockpit computers and LCD displays replaced the analog instruments that had defined MiG-29 cockpits for decades. A digital processor now helps manage the aircraft's systems. One pilot joked that they basically turned a Game Boy into a Game Boy Advance. The comparison is surprisingly accurate. The fundamental hardware remains the same, but the software and interface have been dragged into the modern era. Major Vitam Voyashov spoke about what F-16s could offer that even upgraded MiGs couldn't match. Right now we can only hold the enemy, he explained. With F-16s we could control the air, as well as the seas and the ground, to protect infantry. That statement cuts to the heart of Ukraine's air power problem. Their current fleet can contest the skies, but it cannot dominate them. The MiG-29's GSH-30-1 autocannon is one of the strangest weapons mounted on any modern fighter jet. Unlike Western fighter cannons that typically use revolver or Gatling mechanisms, the GSH uses a short recoil action. This design saves weight and reduces overall size, but it comes with some significant trade-off. The maximum firing rate reaches about 1,800 rounds per minute, though pilots typically operate at 1,500 rounds per minute. That sounds like a lot until you realize the fulcrum only carries 100 rounds of cannon ammunition. Quick math reveals an uncomfortable truth. The MiG-29 can fire its cannon for exactly 4 seconds before running completely dry. 4 seconds. That's everything you get before you're reduced to missiles only. For comparison, the F-16's M61 Vulcan cannon carries 5 times the ammunition. The disparity is enormous, but the limited ammunition capacity isn't just a design flaw. It serves a purpose. The GSH-30's barrel has an incredibly short lifespan of just 2,000 rounds before needing replacement. At maximum firing rate, that's roughly 1 minute and 20 seconds of total trigger time before the entire barrel is worn out. Carrying more ammunition would just encourage pilots to shoot more, accelerating barrel wear without significantly improving combat effectiveness. The cannon's short recoil action generates tremendous heat. To counter this, the fulcrum uses a water tank that evaporates heat away as the cannon fires. And if the cannon malfunctions, the clearing procedure is equally unusual. A small explosive charge fires a steel bolt through the stuck round, igniting the powder and blowing the obstruction out the barrel. It's a solution that screams Soviet engineering philosophy. Brutal, effective, and slightly terrifying. While Western nations have been generous with aircraft donations, the question of ammunition is far more complicated. A fighter jet is only useful if you have missiles and bombs to load onto its hardpoints. Ukraine has a significant advantage here with the MiG-29 that it wouldn't have with F-16s. Ukraine maintains an established domestic production base for MiG-compatible air-to-air missiles. Facilities are actively manufacturing S-125 and R-73 guided missiles. This production capability means Ukraine can replenish its air-to-air munitions without relying entirely on foreign donations. It's one of the hidden reasons why American officials have estimated that transitioning to F-16s would take at least 18 months. It's not just about training pilots or delivering aircraft. It's about establishing the logistics chain for an entirely different ammunition ecosystem. The MiG-29's hardpoint configuration offers flexibility. 7 total mounting points, 3 on each wing and 1 under the fuselage, can carry various combinations of guided missiles, unguided rockets, or even dumb bombs. The fulcrum can carry 6 FAB-500 bombs, each weighing 665 kilograms, to attack ground targets the old-fashioned way. It's not precision-guided munitions dropping through windows, but it works. A recent addition to the MiG-29's arsenal demonstrates just how creative engineers have gotten with these platforms. American AGM-88 HARM missiles have been successfully integrated onto Ukrainian fulcrums. These air-to-ground missiles specifically target enemy radar signatures, allowing pilots to engage Russian air defense systems before entering their kill zones. Fitting an American missile onto a Soviet aircraft required complete reworking of both hardware and software systems. Engineers essentially had to translate two completely different technological languages to make them communicate. Here's a statistic that seems backwards. The MiG-29 is faster than the F-22 Raptor. It's over 300 miles per hour faster than the F-35 Lightning. How can a 40-year-old Soviet aircraft outrun America's latest and greatest fighters? The answer reveals how fundamentally air combat doctrine has changed since the Cold War. In the 1980s, speed was king. Fighter designers obsessed over top velocity and climb rate. The theory was simple. Faster planes could chase down enemies or escape pursuit. Whoever could go faster held the advantage. The MiG-29's climb rate of 330 meters per second and top speed of 2,450 kilometers per hour at altitude represented the pinnacle of this philosophy. But modern warfare has made raw speed largely irrelevant. Air-to-air missiles can now engage targets at ranges measured in dozens of kilometers. Stealth technology allows aircraft to strike without ever being detected. Electronic warfare systems can blind enemy radar before closing to visual range. The need to physically chase down an opponent has evaporated. A modern F-35 doesn't need to outrun a MiG-29. It just needs to detect it first and fire a missile from beyond visual range. This is why you'll never see a modern fulcrum going full afterburner to engage a target. The tactics that made speed valuable no longer exist. What matters now is detection range, missile performance, and electronic warfare capability. Areas where the MiG-29 cannot compete with contemporary Western aircraft. The first time MiG-29s faced American aircraft in conventional combat, the results were devastating. During Operation Desert Storm, Iraqi Air Force fulcrums went up against NATO pilots flying F-16s and F-18s. Every single engagement ended in one of three ways: the MiG-29 retreating, being shot down, or simply crashing. Not a single American aircraft was lost to a fulcrum during the entire campaign. This humiliating performance shaped how Western military analysts viewed the MiG-29 for decades. The aircraft was dismissed as inferior, a product of Soviet propaganda that couldn't compete when actually tested. Ukrainian pilots are acutely aware of this history. It's one of the primary reasons they keep requesting F-16s despite already knowing how to fly MiGs. They've seen the track record. But the Desert Storm comparison isn't entirely fair. Iraqi pilots were poorly trained, flying export variants of the Fulcrum that lacked many advanced features. They were facing opponents with overwhelming numerical superiority, complete electronic warfare dominance, and air support that Iraqi forces couldn't match. The aircraft's performance in that conflict says as much about the overall military situation as it does about the MiG-29 itself. The question for Ukraine is whether they can achieve better results with pilots who have been fighting continuously for over a year, gaining real combat experience that no peacetime training can replicate. Russia has one advantage that Ukraine cannot match: strategic depth. When Russian aircraft aren't conducting combat operations, they can retreat to bases deep inside Russian territory, completely safe from Ukrainian strike. Ukrainian airfields enjoy no such protection. They're under constant threat of ballistic missile attack. This asymmetry has forced Ukrainian MiG-29s into an exhausting pattern of constant relocation. Aircraft hop from one airfield to another, never staying in one place long enough to become targeting data for Russian intelligence. It's an effective survival strategy, but it comes with enormous costs. Fuel consumption skyrockets. Maintenance becomes a nightmare. Pilots and ground crews never get to establish comfortable routines. This might be one of the unspoken reasons why NATO hasn't sent F-16s yet. The concern isn't just about escalation or training timelines. It's about what happens when a $50 million American fighter jet gets caught on the ground by a Russian missile. The political fallout from losing advanced Western aircraft to simple ballistic attacks could be significant. Ukrainian MiG-29s flying today are running at least 1 or 2 sorties daily with minimal downtime for maintenance. Aircraft designed for specific maintenance intervals are being pushed far beyond those limits. Systems that should be inspected are being cleared for flight on visual checks alone. It's a recipe for mechanical failures, and those failures have already started occurring. One of the most valuable but least discussed functions of the MiG-29 in Ukrainian service has nothing to do with shooting down enemies. These aircraft serve as electronic reconnaissance platforms, mapping Russian positions based on the signals they detect. When a Fulcrum pilot picks up radar jamming, radar lock warnings, or electronic warfare emissions, that data gets recorded and analyzed. A concentration of electronic signals in a particular area almost always indicates something worth protecting. Russian headquarters. High-value air defense systems like S-300 batteries. Concentrations of ground forces preparing for operations. By systematically mapping these electronic signatures, Ukrainian military leadership can identify where Russian defenses are strongest and, more importantly, where gaps exist for potential counterattack. The MiG-29 becomes an airborne sensor platform, gathering intelligence that ground-based systems might miss. This reconnaissance function also works in reverse. When pilots detect S-300 systems, they can warn ground commanders to avoid those areas or coordinate strikes to neutralize the threat before advancing. The information flows both ways, creating a more comprehensive picture of the battlefield than either air or ground forces could develop alone. Surviving in contested airspace requires more than just weapons and radar. It requires countermeasures to defeat the missiles hunting you. The newer MiG-29M variant carries twice the chaff and flare dispensers of earlier models, with 60 rounds in each dispenser for a total of 120 countermeasure shot. Chaff consists of tiny metallic strips that create false radar returns, confusing radar-guided missiles. Flares burn at extremely high temperatures, attempting to lure heat-seeking missiles away from the aircraft's engine exhaust. Neither system is foolproof. Modern missiles are designed to ignore countermeasures, but they reduce the odds of a hit significantly enough to be worth carrying. The interplay between all these systems, the countermeasures, the armament, the radar, the fire control, the engines, the maneuverability at different altitudes, creates the complete picture of what the MiG-29 can actually do in combat. No single specification tells the whole story. It's how everything works together that determines whether a pilot comes home. Has earned a reputation similar to the AK-47 rifle or the T-72 tank. It's one of those Soviet designs that seemingly refuses to become obsolete. 40 years after its introduction, Fulcrums are still flying combat missions on multiple continents. At about $23 million per aircraft, the MiG-29 represents an absolute bargain compared to other fourth-generation fighters. This price point made it one of the most popular export fighters in aviation history. Countries that couldn't afford American or European aircraft could still field a credible air force with MiGs. The result is a global fleet of Fulcrums in varying states of modernization and maintenance. The aircraft weighs approximately 24,000 pounds empty and around 32,000 pounds with full fuel. That leaves about 8,000 pounds of payload capacity for weapons and ammunition. The F-16 offers roughly 15,000 pounds of payload, nearly double what the MiG can carry. But payload capacity only matters if you can afford to fill it. Unlike most fourth-generation fighters, the MiG-29 still uses hydraulic flight controls rather than fly-by-wire electronic systems. This seems like a disadvantage, and in many ways it is, but hydraulic systems are also simpler to repair and maintain in field conditions. When you're hopping between improvised airfields and working with limited resources, that simplicity has value. For all its limitations, the MiG-29 possesses one characteristic that remains genuinely impressive: its thrust-to-weight ratio. At 1.07, the Fulcrum generates more thrust than it weighs. For every pound of aircraft, the engines produce 1.07 pounds of push. In practical terms, this means the MiG-29 can do things that make aviation enthusiasts lose their minds. Near vertical climbs, high angle of attack maneuvers that would stall lesser aircraft, and the famous Cobra maneuver, where the pilot pitches the nose up beyond 90 degrees while maintaining forward flight, essentially using the aircraft as an air brake. It looks physically impossible, and on most aircraft it would be. These maneuvers were designed for close-range dogfighting scenarios that rarely occur in modern combat. But they do occasionally happen, and when they do, a pilot who can push their aircraft into an extreme maneuver might create the split-second advantage needed to line up a shot or evade a missile. The overcompensated engines that make these maneuvers possible are also what give the MiG-29 its impressive speed. Soviet designers were obsessed with performance metrics that could match or exceed Western aircraft. They succeeded in many respects. The problem is that performance alone doesn't win modern air wars. The MiG-29s being donated to Ukraine come from various sources with very different histories. At least 5 aircraft originally served in the East German Air Force, acquired by Germany after reunification. Others came from Poland and Slovakia's own inventories. Each source brings its own complications. Export model MiGs often lacked advanced features present in aircraft built for Soviet use. Some have outdated avionics. Others have been poorly maintained for decades. The German aircraft in particular have an interesting history, representing some of the first MiGs that Western intelligence got to examine in detail after the Cold War. There's also the question of what technology NATO countries are willing to share. While Ukraine is receiving upgraded navigation and communication systems, there's plenty of room for criticism that these replacement aircraft aren't receiving the latest available equipment. This pattern has repeated across many military donations to Ukraine. The equipment is helpful but rarely cutting-edge. Still, Ukrainian commanders maintain that any aircraft is better than no aircraft. A pilot without a plane to fly is just an expensive investment in training sitting uselessly on the ground. Getting more fulcrums, even imperfect ones, keeps more pilots in the fight. The MiG-29 Fulcrum represents something rare in modern military aviation. It's an aircraft that has remained relevant through sheer stubbornness, continuing to fly combat missions 4 decades after entering service. Not because it's the best option available, but because it's the option that works right now. Ukrainian pilots don't pretend their MiGs can match modern Western aircraft. They don't claim the Fulcrum will single-handedly turn the tide of the air war. They understand, perhaps better than anyone, exactly what these aging jets can and cannot do. What they need is enough aircraft to maintain pressure on Russian forces while keeping pilots flying and skills sharp. The 33 replacement MiGs from Poland and Slovakia won't transform Ukraine's air capabilities overnight. They'll fill gaps in the roster. They'll allow exhausted aircraft to finally undergo proper maintenance. They'll give Ukraine slightly more flexibility in how it distributes its air assets across a massive front line. Whether F-16s eventually arrive remains an open question. The 18-month timeline American officials cited assumes everything goes smoothly, and nothing about this conflict has gone smoothly. In the meantime, Ukrainian pilots will continue strapping into aircraft older than many of them, hunting drones, dodging missiles, and fighting a war that air power theorists never imagined. The MiG-29 wasn't designed for this. Nothing about its original purpose anticipated hunting cheap Iranian drones over Ukrainian cities or conducting electronic reconnaissance while avoiding ballistic missile strikes on airfield. Yet here it is, still flying, still fighting, still refusing to become obsolete. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the most advanced one. It's the one you have, the one you know, and the one that keeps working no matter what you throw at it. For Ukraine's Air Force, that weapon is a 40-year-old Soviet fighter jet that everyone expected to fail and nobody can seem to replace.